Hello, my name is Dr. Michael Glass. I'm the Regional Studies Association's Territorial Chair for the United States. The Regional Studies Association is a learned society concerned with the analysis of regions and regional issues. Through our international membership, we provide an authoritative voice of and network for students, academics, practitioners, and policymakers. You can find out more about the Regional Studies Association, including information on membership, funding opportunities, and events at regionalstudies.org. I'm pleased to present a new installment of our Regionalists on Film series that introduces you to the work of established and emerging regional scholars and their scholarship. Today, it's my special privilege to introduce Professor Jennifer Clark. Professor Clark is professor and head of the City and Regional Planning section at the Knowlton School in the College of Engineering at The Ohio State University, where she also holds a courtesy appointment with the Department of Geography. She's also visiting professor of city and regional planning with the School of Business at the University of Stavenger in Norway. Professor Clark is the author of numerous articles, book chapters, and books. The most recent book is Uneven Innovation, the Work of Smart Cities, which won the 2021 Urban Affairs Association Best Book Award. She's also the author of Working Regions, Reconnecting Innovation and Production in the Knowledge Economy. She's a fellow of the Regional Studies Association and a fellow of the American Association of Geographers, and serves as Deputy Editor-in-Chief of the Regional Studies Association's flagship journal, Regional Studies. Professor Clark, welcome.
Thank you, Michael. What a lovely introduction.
But it's all true. And maybe we could get started by talking about the pathway into this career in regional studies. How did you first get interested in researching regions and regional development?
Yeah, this is an interesting question. And I've been trying to kind of pinpoint the answer to this because I think it's a little bit challenging for me to pinpoint it. And I think my original interest is probably more experiential than academic. I've probably been interested in regional development for as long as I can remember. And I think it really, I suspect it comes from my experience as a child, because in my family, we moved back and forth from the US to South Korea, back and forth, and staying in each place at different times and going back and forth. And my experience then was going to Seoul and seeing it change. Like I would go and then come back to the States for a few years and go back again. And at that time, it was just changing so fast. Like, the 80s, the 70s, 80s, and 90s in a place like South Korea was changing so fast. And it wasn't just a question of sort of new buildings, it was like whole new infrastructures, right? Whole new systems were evolving. And so it was very much what I thought was there wasn't there when I went back, right? So, and it was true coming back to the States too, where I would come back to cities in the US and I would see things that had changed. But the pace of change was so different, right? I mean, the pace of change. And so for me, very early on, there was this issue of change, regional development, but also this issue of variability that you couldn't just count. There wasn't one pace of change, right? The different places were variable in how this happened. So that was very much an experiential issue. In terms of my academic interest, I think my focus is really on regional economic development as opposed to, say, land use planning or local economic development, sort of other pieces of sort of regional planning and regional studies. And I think that came really later. That came more in sort of my academic work, and it came probably from when I first became really familiar with economic geography and the questions around the sort of what's the spatial distribution of economic activity. I got very interested in that as not just a descriptive question, but I think the descriptive question is really important and understudied, frankly, but also a question of factors. What is it that actually changes and creates the spatial distribution of economic activity? And again, variation is something that was always super interesting to me.
All right, that's really interesting. And yeah, I can relate to that sense of how regionalism works in different places, and just the differences in the way that occurs is a fascinating thing to look at. Now, it does require a little bit of interdisciplinarity to look at that as well. And while your work is interdisciplinary in nature, you're closely associated with planning and economic geography. Could you say a little bit about how those disciplines intersect in your work and what they add to an examination of regional studies?
Yeah, I think, I mean, in the US context, I think that it's interesting when you talk to people about regional studies, because I think it gets conflated with regional science very often. And regional science is a smaller tent than regional studies, which is a bigger tent, I think. And regional science, at least as sort of a sub-discipline, really evolved in parallel to urban and regional planning, and is sort of methodologically distinct from urban and regional planning, I think, in the sense that it really focuses on firms and industries, right? And the spaces in which firms and industries and sectors are operating. That's what regional science is. Regional studies is a bigger tent than that. But I think that the thing that's really interesting about both is that they're kind of interested in this question of functional and territorial regionalism, right? Which is really distinct, I think, from the questions around political science, questions around of public administration. So when I think about sort of like what's regional studies as an interdisciplinary discipline, one of the things that regional studies does is it doesn't take the jurisdiction as a given, right? So it actually says, okay, from a regional studies perspective, we're looking at more sort of the operations, the functionality of what's going on. So a lot of that aligns with sort of labor markets, land, housing markets. That's sort of where the alliance with regional science fits, is that question of operation of markets, right? But the issue of really governance is broader than sort of the question of jurisdiction. So I think it's an interesting, so what I find from my perspective in regional studies as in the editorial role there is that sometimes people, the boundaries of sort of regional studies are wide, but we don't see, I see most often sort of political science or public administration misunderstand what regional studies is, if that makes sense. So I'm giving you an answer that's both the question of what is and what isn't, right? Regional studies, because a lot of times what we see from the journal perspective is people that I mean, most everyone gets it, right? Because they've read Ames and Scope, so they get it. But sometimes people sort of misunderstand, and so sometimes the question of what are the core concerns? The core concerns of regional studies really are much more than the question of what a political scientist typically brings to the table, because governance is not just a question of defining the jurisdiction or defining the tools, the existing tools. Governance is a question of firms, it's networks, it's a question well beyond the question of sort of the role of the state as a jurisdictional administrator.
It creates a real need for a synoptic perspective on whatever the core issue is that you're looking at. And a lot of your work obviously has dealt with issues of innovation, the innovation economy, and recently the Smart Cities project, which is really the subject of your most recent book. It's asking more pointed questions about what the smart city is, who it's for, who it's benefiting. What are some of the avenues that you explored in that book? And can you explain how what that project has added to your understanding of city-region development?
Yeah, I was really interested in, and one of the arguments I tried to make in Uneven Innovation really was a case for smart cities being part of regional economic development, rather than being something that sort of sat apart from regional economic development. And the argument that I was basically making is that the urban technology project is a longer project than smart cities. Smart cities is just sort of a current iteration of the idea of how do we diffuse technology into urban space, but urban and regional space. It's not really the sort of use of the word city in smart cities is an interesting story in and of itself. it's certainly not a question of a limitation in terms of the implementation of the technologies itself. So what we're talking about really is whether or not, people who are involved in economic geography or urban and regional planning or regional studies more broadly have the tools and have the analytical sort of background to look at a question like the urban technology project in smart city and be able to bring some sort of light, shine some sort of light on these questions. And my argument in uneven innovation is, well, yeah, who else could do it, right? We're the people who know how technology diffusion happens. That's part of what innovation studies within regional studies does. But we're also the people who know things about sort of the backstory of the history of cities and regions and how they operate as regional economies. And so part of my argument in the book, and I continue to make this argument, is that when we think about smart cities, we need to think about what they actually are, which is they're about differential investments in systems, in infrastructure, in services. And that's all well within the wheelhouse of people who study regional, who are part of regional studies. So I thought that that we kind of needed to have a conversation about that within the field. From my perspective, sitting in an urban and regional planning department, one of my concerns have been that I was not seeing a lot of planners, urban planners, involved in the conversation about smart cities as it initially evolved. I saw much more people who were involved in technology, it was sort of overlapping with urban geography, coming to the question around very much a sort of a critical perspective or critical studies perspective. The limitation there, of course, is that this is happening. And because this is happening, there needed to be something beyond just a critical perspective. There had to be an engaged perspective, which is sort of one of the distinctions between urban and regional planning and urban geography, is urban geographers can critique and urban and regional planners got to deal with it. And so, again, you can think about economic geography and economic development in a similar sort of, way, which is that economic geography can do the analysis and policy recommendations, and economic development people end up carrying it through to implementation, right? So insofar as regional studies has an applied component to it, right? And I think that's something we talk about probably less than we should within the discipline, is that there is sort of a applied component of regional studies because of its relationship to those applied disciplines, whether they be within economic development or business and management or urban and regional planning or some sorts of public administration and public policy. So part of what we want to be able to do is talk about regional studies as how it fits into a broader disciplinary conversation from an academic perspective, but also how it fits into a practice.
Right, because if you're not part of that conversation, then there is going to be no excuse for when you're critiquing those things down the line 5-10 years out. So I guess my next question would be how you would recommend that regional scholars best position themselves to become part of those conversations when it matters.
Yeah, and this has been a conversation within regional studies as the interdisciplinary field, but also within the journal for many years. And I think it's actually really interesting to go back and read some of the conversations about public policy and regional studies that have emerged over about the last 20-25 years, because there is this sort of ebb and flow about we want to be very engaged with public policy, and then people say no, we don't want to be that engaged in public policy. It is this back and forth. And of course, it also relates a lot to what's happening in practice insofar as when the EU in particular gets involved with regional policies like smart specialization, or when the UK in particular gets involved with its different regional devolution schemes, which always precipitates a whole discussion about the public policy and analysis around and evaluation too. The US tends to be a little bit further out on an outlier in this because we don't do a lot of regional policy, at least not from the national scale, right? We try to do it under the radar, regional policy. But I think what's happening recently, and I do think that this is distinct, and by which I mean like in the last 3 to 5 years, is that there's an increasing awareness amongst the public in general and policymakers, and maybe even among the media as well, that we're beginning to see, understand what regions are, right? And understanding why regional studies and regional development really matter. And I think that that has a lot to do with questions around sustainability, equity, and resilience. Sort of the question of the problems that are in front of us are really hard to ignore now, right? So this is the issue of, you know, when we talk about in the media recently, it's been reported quite a bit over the last couple of years around supply chains and logistics. You know, when I was doing a lot of work on supply chains and logistics and manufacturing, maybe, I'm not going to say quite a decade ago, but maybe around then, like nobody was listening. You know, this was not something that the media generally was very interested in. Although the problems that were existing in terms of supply chains and in terms of being just really, really elongated, very, very, how do I say this, with holes like Swiss cheese. Like, you know, if you looked around at supply chains, particularly in the US, you could literally identify where the breaks were, you know, where there, and by breaks, I don't mean slowdowns, I mean like where things were not being produced within the national economy, and we're going to make it very, very hard to actually get to the end product if you were ever not able to get this good from someplace else, right? This intermediate good. So those sorts of things, like, oh, the media cares about supply chains all of a sudden. Those sorts of questions, public health, if you think about this idea that public health has a supply chain behind it, that was not a conversation we were having, you know, 3 years ago. The idea that public health actually is not just an individual concern or a community concern, and by which I mean a community of interest, right? But is actually really has to do with transmission questions, really has to do with support questions and system and health system questions, which are again much bigger or regional. So these questions around climate, response to climate change, it's going to be at least a regional response, right? And so we do see municipalities, you know, passing ordinances about climate change and initiatives and all these things, but there's an increasing understanding that jurisdiction is insufficient to actually make the change and create the solutions that need to happen. So I think for regional studies scholars, this thematic approach, and by which I mean around sustainability and resilience and equity that is emerging, I think really changes the conversation about social welfare and economic growth and change, and is pushing sort of our constituency, which to conceptualize of regions in a way that was really hard for them to do before, because we're sort of trained to understand jurisdictions and administrative jurisdictions as those who can intervene in regulation and governance, rather than understanding that we can create the interventions in regulation and governance to sort of match the need, create the solution to address the problem. So I think that's, a pretty exciting and different situation, at least different from when I came into regional studies. And the other piece I would say that strikes me is really around methodology, and this is a little bit me returning to my regional science, regional analysis roots, which is I really do think that we need to think about moving beyond sort of the 20th century modeling that dominates some of our tools, especially our quantitative tools, and think a little bit more about whether we got to move beyond taking big data. So we've got the great big data sets now, and we want to plug them into the same models, the same regional science models, the same sort of econometrics models that we inherited from economics. And I'm not sure that that's going to work real well for us. I think that it's the new data, especially new time series data, and sort of measuring different things, but continuing to get new data. I think that is actually really useful. It allows us to do a lot of triangulation. This is my research design hat, right? Which I think is really important. And I think the data visualization tools that we have are just open up a whole new world to in terms of not just the analysis and question rigor with the analysis, but also communication of the analysis for these questions of policy change. So, that's where I think the emphasis on methodology really, I'd like to see a little bit more of that. In terms of qualitative, I think we have great qualitative tools within regional studies, and disappointed in that. I guess this is an understatement. In COVID times, just so made it hard for people to do that deep qualitative research that is so critical to what we do, especially in comparative regional studies. I'm really hoping we can get back to that, because we need that nuance. We need that sort of deep analysis, and it was one of the things that we talked about within the regional studies editors team. I think we did an editorial right at the beginning of the pandemic, or about a year in, where we talked about this question of really our concerns about methodology moving forward. And I think I continue to think that that's something that the community needs.
It sounds like overall the assessment of where regional studies as a field is incredibly positive and optimistic from your perspective.
Yeah, I think that it is. And one of the things that I really like about the Regional Studies Association is, and especially how it's evolved over time, is that it's become this very supportive network, right? And this network where we were actually supporting junior scholars, we're supporting students. We've got this more networked approach. I mean, you are doing this great regional infrastructure network, which is exactly the kind of thing where I think the recognition that it's not just one voice or one scholar that's going to move this mountain, it's going to be a team. And so I feel like Regional Studies Association has taken that on board. It's a big remit, like it's a big brief, but I think that it's ambitious. But I think we've got to be ambitious. I think these challenges, but also these opportunities, require us to be ambitious, but also be team, be oriented on a team.
You don't need to do it all alone, that's for sure. That's all the time we have to talk with Professor Clark, but I'd like to thank her for joining us today to share her perspective on regional scholarship. I'd also like to encourage all of you to learn more about the work that the Regional Studies Association is doing at regionalstudies.org. Jennifer, would you care to have the last word today?
Well, I would just like to thank you for taking this approach. I think it's going to be great.
All right, thanks so much. I'll see you soon.